Come, spellweavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin' Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin' Bones with Ryan Howard, your RPG treasure trove where we are making old school young again. I am your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard, also known as the R in OSR, and this evening we have the distinct pleasure of having a return guest on the show. He is one of the best minds out there when it comes to thinking about RPG combat tactically, both from a player perspective and a game master perspective. He's the author of The Monsters Know What They're Doing and the recently released How to Defend Your Lair. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back to Rollin' Bones, Mr. Keith Ammann. Keith, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This is such an interesting and important topic, but it's one that so few people actually talk about. So any chance to actually have discussions about taking a tactical approach to RPG combat and what that means both from the GM and the player perspective is something that I really value. So I'm glad that we're able to do this tonight and talk about these topics here.
Awesome.
So as we were talking about before we jumped on here tonight, last time you were on the show, The Monsters Know What They Were Doing, or The Monsters Know What They're Doing, was a blog and was about to be released as a book. So it's been quite a while. You've actually released 2 other books between The Monsters Know What They're Doing and this current one. So to play a little bit catch up here, let's talk a little bit about those other books that came out between The Monsters Know What They're Doing and this one, just to give people kind of a full overview of what you have to offer out there.
Sure. Well, it's kind of funny because I noticed somewhere along the line that on Amazon and Bookshop and other places they were starting to number the books like they're part of a series, which in a sense I suppose they are, except that if I had originally been thinking about numbering them as a series, I might have released them in a different order. Because what we have is The Monsters Know, the original book, and then Live to Tell the Tale, Combat Tactics for Player Characters, which is my apology of action to all the players who got clobbered by DMs who started using tactics they weren't ready for. And then I released the 3rd book chronologically, which in spirit is the direct sequel to The Monsters Know, and that's More Monsters Know What They're Doing, which contains the monsters from Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. And that came out at the beginning of this year. And then just last week, my 4th book, How to Defend Your Lair, came out. And I don't really think of these books as being sequential in any particular way, except for More Monsters coming after The Monsters Know. But as far as my publisher and the bookstores are concerned, they're numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I guess series have cachet. So
yeah. Has your publisher had any discussions with you about any kind of omnibus format now that it's kind of been turned into a series?
No, we haven't talked about that. And to be honest, with 1D&D and the promised changes and updates coming to 5th edition in 2024, And the amount of time it takes to get a trade book from manuscript to publication, it's kind of right now a bad time to even be thinking about releasing revised editions, because those of us outside Wizards of the Coast just have absolutely no idea what's coming. And, I don't want to write a book that's going to be obsolete by the time it drops. That actually almost happened with More Monsters. I did not know there was going to be a Monsters of the Multiverse until I had already returned the third proof of More Monsters.
Yep.
At that point, there's absolutely nothing I can do about the content of that book. So, when Monsters of the Multiverse was released in a standalone edition, as opposed to being part of that box set, I quickly went to the blog and wrote updates of all of the monsters whose tactics might have been significantly affected by the changes in Monsters of the Multiverse. And there were some of those. It was surprisingly nice how much of More Monsters still held up. A very, very large amount of that still held up. There were some minor changes. Some of them were pretty much just cosmetic. Some of them were only subtractive. Like, there were some things that you could have done before that you couldn't do with Monsters of the Multiverse. And so out of a list of 6 different things that a monster might do, maybe you lost 2 of them and you just take them out of the priority order. But there were a handful that were changed completely. And so anyone who's got More Monsters or is thinking of buying More Monsters and is using it with Monsters the Multiverse, just go to themonstersknow.com, and in the menu there's a Monsters the Multiverse updates item in the menu, and that will take you to all of my articles that deal with the changes that book wrought.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this has been a resource that a lot of people have come to rely very heavily on. In my chat here, Crafty Matt says that it's The Monsters Know is one of the first books that he recommends to any new game master. And he also, and this is an interesting point that I kind of want your comment on here, Crafty says that there is no need to apologize for what you did to the players in The Monsters Know, because there's, and I agree with him on this, there's an aspect of intelligent monsters that your players have to go up against. They're not just going to stand there and essentially trade punches if that's not what the monster would do based on the information that we have on them from the published material. What you're doing is creating a more rewarding and more challenging game where the players then have to figure out the tactics that the monster is using, how they're thinking, and then kind of dismantle them
and counter them. Yeah.
So
I disagree with that only slightly, and the reason is that I read my mail and I got messages from DMs who were saying, oh wow, your stuff is awesome, I used this and I killed my entire player's party. And I'm like, that's not what I was going for. I was not trying to write a TPK manual. What I was trying to do was what you just said, give players an appropriate challenge that they can defeat but have to work to defeat and have to think to defeat. So that the success is more satisfying, and also to bring a greater sense of presence and flavor, and really feeling like you're there and this is an intelligent entity that you're going up against. I was not trying to achieve player wipes or party wipes, and so that was the whole reason why I wrote Live to Tell the Tale in the first place, which began as a self-published ebook that I was selling through my blog. And when I had the opportunity to have it republished by Saga Press, I revised and expanded it significantly, and tried to make it more useful in a wider variety of ways for players. And that is a book also that I would like to bring some revisions to, because I think I could have maybe written it a little better as a teaching tool. I mean, I think it's good as it stands, but I think maybe if I were doing it today, I would take the sample battles and put a little more of a, here are some things you might do in this situation. What do you think the player should actually choose? And then, like, go through some of the reasoning like that. Make it a little more Socratic,
Hmm. Yeah.
as opposed to as opposed to just demonstrating what the good tactics look like. Like, give people a chance to think about it a little bit more. And maybe after one D&D comes out, I'll have the opportunity to revise it that way, which is something I would like very much to do.
Hmm. Yeah, Jonathan Rock in chat here makes a good point. Questing Beast released a video today talking about the DM gap in 5e and how it looks like there's kind of a shortage of DMs running 5e. And this is something we actually talked a little bit about in your first appearance, which I know was years ago, but I think the problem presented in 5e that I really think 1D&D needs to prioritize fixing is the information that the dungeon master needs to know to run effective tactical combat and to make full use of the systems that are present in the game to run combats that are challenging and interesting. They need to be front and center and not hidden in various weird esoteric places that a lot of GMs just won't look because they don't know to look there.
I have heard similar critiques from people just about the organization of the Dungeon Master's Guide in general, and about what it ought to include. Um, I personally don't have a lot of problems with that, but I think a lot of that, in my case, has to do with um, I don't know, the way I use books like that, and the way I just kind of establish associations so I know where to find things. Like, for example, all of the things that I might need to refer to on the fly in a game, I know that those are within a few pages of page 249. I know they're all in chapter 8. I just think of chapter 8 as if I need to know something mid-game, I go to chapter 8. And usually I go to page 249 and then just flip forward or backward until I find the thing I need, and it's right there for me. I know that chapter 9 has action options in it, like overrun and disarm and climb onto a bigger creature. I know that the encounter building guidelines are in chapter 3. I know all the treasure and magic item stuff is in chapter 7. And so I just go straight to those places, and I know to do that because I've like established that geography in my brain.
Yeah.
I don't need to think about where to go. I know where to go. I don't need to know the exact page number to know that if I flip to these chapters, I'm going to be in the right neighborhood. But yes, I have heard a lot of people say that one of the things 5e could really use is a reimagining of the DMG, and I genuinely expect, I am confident that we're actually going to see that. I have no inside knowledge of it, but just, based on things that have trickled out through people that I do trust, I'm pretty sure we will see something like that.
And Crafty Matt has another question in chat here. Have you considered the possibility of doing something similar to the Monsters Know, but focused on other systems, like say one for Pathfinder or one for Old School Essentials, or something like that?
No. And I will tell you, no, I'll tell you exactly why. It's this simple. I have a trade publisher.
Yep.
I work through an imprint of Simon and Schuster, Saga Press. And if I come to them and say, "Hey, I have an idea for a book that is about Pathfinder," they're going to say, "That's very nice. Find someone to publish it, because we're not going to." D&D is big enough that a publisher like Saga Press will publish books aimed at that audience of players. Even Pathfinder, which is I believe I think either Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu is number 2 in the number of people who actually I just looked this up earlier today and I have it in Notepad. Let me why am I speculating on this? Yeah. So number 1 is D&D, number 2 is Call of Cthulhu, number 3 is Pathfinder. Then you have Vampire in the Other World of Darkness games. Then the Powered by the Apocalypse games, Dungeon World, then Star Wars RPG, and then everything else.
Gotcha.
So Call of Cthulhu is number 2. If I go to the publisher and say, "Hey, I'm going to write something like this, but for people who play Call of Cthulhu," there's not going to be any interest. Only D&D has a big enough audience to appeal to a trade publisher in that way. So either I write about D&D or I write about all role-playing games in general, or I do a hybrid of that like I did in How to Defend Your Lair, where all of the examples are taken from D&D 5e, and I talk about D&D 5e mechanics in it, but the principles are broadly applicable to just about any system you want to play in. Aside from, I don't know, Honey Heist or something like that.
Yeah.
But if I had said, I'm going to write something just for Star Wars or just for Cypher System, Pathfinder, even Call of Cthulhu, it's not going to fly.
Right.
That's the publishing industry.
Yeah.
Something like that I would have to publish on my own, and it probably just would not give me the same bang for the buck.
Right. Yeah, and that's understandable. But what I will say, to Crafty's point, any game that has the same monsters, like I'll use Old School Essentials because I'm preparing an Old School Essentials campaign right now. It has a lot of the same monsters as 5e just because of the nature of it being a retro clone of Basic Expert D&D. Those tactics that you list, while the mechanics might not be necessarily one for one similar, it's the same monster, so those tactics should still be kind of broadly applicable. The orcs in OSE can behave in the same way that you would have them behave in The Monsters Know What They're Doing. So I still think, even if you never run 5e, if you're running any kind of medieval fantasy game, it's worth reading the book just to get an understanding of kind of the inner workings of these creatures' minds.
Yes and no. I will say, anyone who finds value in what I do, who wants to try applying it to a different system like OSR or Pathfinder or some sort of thing, can just take the same approach I do and think systematically about what does each line in this creature's stat block say about how it might function given this particular set of game rules. The method of thinking you can apply to anything. But some monsters have changed in some pretty significant ways. And just to seize on a simple example, goblins. The very first monster that most D&D 5e players encounter because of the Lost Mines of Phandelver. The very first monster that is in the Monsters Know. They're on the cover. Goblins. If you go back and look at the AD&D Monster Manual, at what goblins are, they are not the slippery little hit-and-run attackers that they are in 5e. They're basically just mooks who like to take slaves. I mean, I'm glad they got away from that, but and made goblins more interesting, because I think the 5e iteration of goblins is way more interesting than that. But yeah, some monsters have changed fairly significantly in their portrayal, in their abilities. Um, and that's not even getting into the things that people have tried to do in the last several years to um, move the game away from some of the pernicious stereotypes that had kind of infected it in the earliest years. Um, there, it's now you can certainly um, adopt the new visions of the goblin and these other monsters and homebrew, use homebrew to port that back into AD&D. You can play the thought experiment of what would a 5e goblin look like using AD&D rules. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
If you're still an AD&D player. Um, but yeah, there are some differences there.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that chat here is agreeing with you on is a lot of the people who have read this book but run primarily in other systems mostly use it to get to thinking about monsters in a way that makes for good encounters. And rather than kind of taking specifics if they're not running 5e, it's more kind of reminding themselves how to think tactically and how to put themselves in the headspace of the monster. So for that, I also think that it's a good resource. So there's that. Those of you who are mulling over a potential purchase of Keith's books. Now, I do want to get into this current book, How to Defend Your Lair, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. The fact that in RPG worlds, there is this hole in the ground where someone has placed treasure and traps to protect that treasure, ostensibly, but there's also monsters hanging around in there. All of that has reasoning behind it, and I feel like that's one of the main selling points of How to Defend Your Lair is understanding what someone might find worth defending, the reasons why they might find it being worth defending, and then how to go about effectively defending a lair or stronghold to protect those things that are actually precious to the GM and the GM's kind of NPCs.
Yeah, like when you're talking about the putting in the treasure and then putting in the traps to protect the treasure, it's always worth asking when somebody put these traps in, because somebody had to do it. What were they thinking? Like, who did they think they were placing these traps to stop? Why did they think this particular trap in this particular location would be effective at doing that? Why did they choose this trap over a different trap? And one of the things I mention in the book is that there is a long tradition in D&D and I'm sure in other role-playing games of choosing the villain, drawing the map, populating the map with minions or other creatures, maybe wandering monsters, sprinkling in a few traps, and then choosing the treasure and deciding where to put it, which is a suitable way, I suppose, to generate a random dungeon on the fly. But if you actually have a villain with motivations and with treasure worth taking, that villain is going to be primarily interested in protecting its assets and its treasure. And it's going to construct its lair in such a way to do that. And so what I'm suggesting is that you begin with the villain and whatever the villain is trying to protect, which may be treasure, may be information, may just be the villain's own life. I call these the three L's: loot, lives, and lore.
Mhm.
Um, and then everything else in the lair, the other creatures, the traps, the architecture, is all going to be built with that purpose in mind, to create a place where the villain can effectively carry out whatever activities it's engaging in and protect those assets from intruders.
Mhm.
And so that's the central idea around which everything else in the book is built.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and again, these are things a lot of people should think about, but don't necessarily think about. A lot of times when people set up their dungeons or set up their bad guy's lair, it turns into kind of a. It's almost like the Haunted Mansion at Disney World, only you have to fight things occasionally. So you go into a room and this thing pops up. This challenge
Hmm.
pops up and you have to deal with it. You have to fight it. Then you go into another room and another thing
Yeah.
pops up. There's not really given when you're on the Haunted Mansion, you're not thinking about, hey, why is why are those busts in the graveyard singing? Who decided to enchant that to
Yeah.
you don't think about that because you're on an amusement
Are the
park
eyes
ride.
in that portrait watching me?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, where did that come from? How did that help anyone?
But again, this is not this isn't the Haunted Mansion or
Hmm.
whatever dark ride at whatever amusement park, because of the nature of the game that we're playing here, a role-playing game. These things were done for a reason and have, like gotten this way for a reason. So understanding that
Yeah.
reason and making it practical to the goal of your enemy is something that really every dungeon master should take another look at when it comes to their dungeon designs.
And I have always, I mean, even back when I was 18 years old and quite honestly didn't know how to think about this stuff, I have always been a little bit obsessed with cause and effect in RPGs.
Hmm.
Um, and with the idea that the world you are playing in is a living place full of other creatures that have their own business that they go about when the PCs aren't around. Things keep happening. They don't only happen because the PCs are looking. Monsters are not waiting around in rooms for the PCs to show up. They've got stuff to do. And they know things. They know things that the PCs don't know. The PCs know things that they don't know. And that's an interesting imbalance to explore the implications of.
Mhm.
And back in the day, in Dragon magazine, there was this series of articles, the ecology of the purple worm, the ecology of the beholder, the ecology of the mind flayer, and it was all about how all of these monsters fit into some kind of niche in the setting. And I wouldn't say those were a direct influence on me, but they were a very, very strong indirect influence on me. The fact that they existed is very consistent with the approach that I always take. I always want my D&D settings to feel very alive, very lived in. I want them to feel real. And I know that desire comes in for some mockery from people who are like, this is a fantasy world. Anything can happen.
Mhm.
Dragons fly, magic exists. And I'm like, yes, but everything that is not explicitly fantastic should work the same way it does in the real world. Fantasy is not an excuse for just letting any old thing happen with no explanation whatsoever.
Mhm.
It's it's not an excuse for not thinking about how something might have come to pass.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's taking a world and saying there can be awe-inspiring things in here, wild, heroic things, implausible things, but they still all happen for a reason. And when the gods are not meddling and wizards are not meddling and you don't have any supernatural forces working on this patch of the world, then it reverts to normal physics and biology and chemistry and causality.
Yeah.
Um, and so for me, I really like anchored fantasy as opposed to anything goes fantasy.
Right.
And that's how I always try to. That's the mentality that I bring to everything I write and every game I run.
Absolutely. And to answer Max in chat here, Max from Legion of Myth, I don't think what we're saying here is that every single skeleton needs to have like an origin story of how they got there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Stuff like he mentioned specifically a carrion crawler and a skeleton. Skeletons, especially if it's something that's been sufficiently buried for a long period of time, anything that went down there before you or anything that died down there, it makes sense for a skeleton to be down there. And then a carrion crawler, they're subterranean and they also look for dead things to eat. So, if this is something where other adventurers have gone in or, someone has died there recently, yeah, carrion crawler could just be there because it makes sense based on what that thing is that it would be there.
I tend to treat monstrosities as evolved creatures. I tend to operate on the assumption that a monstrosity is an evolved creature, just like an animal, with the exception that it's encountered very rarely, or it has been it's part of a population that has been magically or divinely influenced in some way before natural selection kicked in again. And so unless a monstrosity is one of a kind, it has to have some way to sustain itself. It has to have some way to reproduce itself. And when you have sustenance and reproduction, you have evolution. And so any given creature is going to have evolved to survive in its niche. Sorry, accidentally bumped the mute button there. To survive in its niche. And even if it's weird, even if it's unnatural or unusually belligerent, a monster is just an animal that's weirder and scarier.
Yep.
For the most part. Now, when you get into other creature types, then you've got different forces working. But monstrosities are basically just something went a little haywire somewhere, and but they want their food, they want their territory, and they don't care about much else.
So what I'm hearing here is, let's use the example of the rust monster, and I think this is something that's gonna scare some players out there. Rust monsters
are ridiculous.
Yes.
Let's just lay that out right now. Rust monsters were originally created specifically to punish fighters who put on too much armor.
Yeah.
It was just a jerk move by one of those original dungeon masters. That is why rust monsters exist. So you really have to reverse engineer a reason why they could even possibly exist. To justify putting them in the game. But
yeah, if you are playing a game where you have rust monsters and those rust monsters have to eat metal to survive, essentially, it would make sense that almost any buried treasure room is going to be infested with them.
Oh, not necessarily, because how much buried treasure is actually iron? If it's all copper and silver and gold, they're not going to care.
Yeah, fair enough.
They want iron.
Yep.
Now, to find them in an iron mine would be absolutely plausible.
Yep.
Find them, let's say you're running an Eberron campaign where you've actually got a little bit of industry. Rust monsters are going to infest the machinery, you know? A If you have a large armory or smithy in a kingdom and the rust monsters come in, there you got. I've got a one of my sample lairs, which I had a lot of fun with in How to Defend Your Lair, is an archfey named Greengrasp. He's a fey dire troll. And and I had the idea, like, he's got these four arms and they're always just kind of grasping. Because he is the embodiment of avarice. And he's got this opulent palace where he likes to show off his conspicuous consumption, but he's also completely paranoid, and has all his treasury in this very, very thick-walled tower. And his greatest frustration in life is that somehow his Fey domain got infested by Zorn. And the Zorn just like are burrowing around under his land, and getting into his corundum mines and eating up all the rubies and sapphires that he wants to have in his possession. And this whole thing just drives him so crazy that while he could have, he probably could have more guards defending his realm than he does, he has to devote a chunk of his resources to stamping out the Zorn problem. And so he's got some dedicated units of Zorn hunters that you can encounter within his domain, whose sole purpose is to hunt down Zorns and get rid of them. And that is where, that goes back to my original concept, is what assets does your villain have? Mm-hmm. How does the villain defend those assets? Who are they defending those assets from? Greengrasp is not primarily concerned with defending his assets from adventurers. He doesn't have a problem with adventurers. He has problems with rivals and with Zorn. Mm-hmm. And so all of his security measures around his palace are geared toward preventing incursions from agents of other envious archfey and Zorn. Mm-hmm. And so player characters, adventurers, may actually have a little bit of an edge if they want to try to nick some of his stuff, because they are not what he was primarily concerned about defending against.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it's kind of the opposite tendency of GMs who just kind of set up the fun house or the haunted house dungeon. The ones who, because they know the player's plan, they then kind of build their dungeon around, here's everything that I basically, here's all the stuff that I know as the GM to kind of foil all of your typical shenanigans, mm-hmm. in a situation where it's probable that whoever operates that dungeon, or whoever, especially if it's a dungeon and it's ancient, they didn't know that your players, relied very heavily on fire magic, because they were dead thousands of years before your players showed up. So having your dungeons and your layers kind of specifically geared towards, these are the priorities of the figure who created this thing, or the villain who created this thing. I think that's an interesting concept to play off of.
Mm. Now you contrast Greengrasp's palace with the last lair in the book, the toughest one, the Lich's Crypt. Mm-hmm. Now, the Lich is explicitly defending against not just adventurers, but the player characters specifically.
Right.
Why? Because he's a Lich. And a Lich is paranoid and brilliant. And he figured out back when the PCs were level 11 that they were going to be a problem for him. And he has already tried to infiltrate them and assassinate them. He knows they're coming.
Yep.
He is specifically trying to make sure that they cannot do anything to stop him. And so that is a very different approach that he takes from Greengrasp,
Yep.
and one that is probably going to be more familiar to people accustomed to your typical D&D type dungeon.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the mechanisms that you mentioned very early on in this book related towards that is the idea of spies and espionage.
Yeah.
And again, this is something that I've overlooked in my campaigns, and I think a lot of people overlook. If you have this kind of big overarching bad guy who your ultimate goal is, the players are eventually going to run afoul of this guy. As soon as your players start to make names for themselves, the villain's agents should be, if not directly on their trail, at least asking questions about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those who are interested, one of the things I talk about is how spies pretty much fall into two categories. Those who are solely responsible for passively gathering information, and those who are responsible for actively gathering information about particular potential threats. So the spies in the first category are referred to in the craft as gray people. They are people you don't even notice. They're not important enough to notice. They're in the background. They don't stand out in any way. The housekeeper at the inn, the beggar in the market square, people you just don't even pay attention to. Maybe you even try to avoid their gaze because their presence makes you a little uncomfortable. But they are watching, they are listening, and they are reporting what they see and hear back to whoever is employing them. The second type, the ones that actively gather information, they are charismatic, memorable, and good at working themselves into the good graces of the people they're spying on. And I ran a Bust My Lair game for some friends, and I put them through the Aboleth Lair, the Aboleth Grotto. And this Aboleth has basically taken over an entire town, managed to get all of them to come within 1 mile of this cenote. It's based on the cenotes of the Yucatan Peninsula. Karst sinkholes that have filled up with water. And this one happens to have underground conduits that lead all the way back to the ocean, as some of the cenotes do. And so because the Aboleth has gotten everyone to come within 1 mile, it has literally managed to mind control every single person in the entire village. Plus, there are a few deep scions wandering around the village in disguise, and these are the Aboleth's spies. When my players came into the village and most of the villagers didn't really want to talk to them. They were a little standoffish. But one of the deep scions, disguised as a regular human, came up to them and was friendly. And I used some of these techniques of asking them a lot of questions about themselves and mirroring their gestures and their ways of speaking. And the players bit so hard on that hook they thought they had made a best friend
Hmm.
until it became obvious that they hadn't.
Right.
This stuff works. It works uncannily well.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that's a situation where it helps to know your players and know
Hmm.
the kinds of things that will get them to bite. Because I think every GM has had a situation where they introduced an NPC with the idea that this will be someone who's friendly and the players hate them. And ultimately, they
Yeah.
become an adversary, or they introduce someone who's not
Or
supposed
they
to be.
become obsessed with someone completely
Yeah.
insignificant instead. Yeah.
Yeah, so once you've kind of figured out who your players are going to glom onto, having someone like that in the employ of
Hmm.
your villain will definitely set them up for a similar situation like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it really is interesting. The ways in which kind of like the psychology of the game and the way that your villain would operate and the way that player characters operate and the psychology of the players at the table, where those things meet, where they conflict with each other. That's an interesting aspect of role-playing games in general that
Hmm.
I think a lot of people notice, but I don't know that a lot of people have words to describe them.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say so too.
Yeah, from what I've read so far, I'm about a quarter of the way through this book. This is a really good resource for anyone who's really looking to kind of level up their um, their particular dungeon design or layer design. And I'm glad that you give examples as well, because a lot of
Hmm.
people can read text like this and say, okay, I understand the idea. I'm not sure how to put that into practice. But the examples that you give in the book do give people that impression of here are ways to employ various kind of means discussed in the book. So
Hmm.
having examples is always a good thing for people, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I worked with some very, very good map illustrators and gave them a lot of leeway in how they drew the maps. I basically, for each layer, worked with a single illustrator and said, these are the things that the layer has to include. Um, Here's sort of the general rough layout I'd like it to have. Um, and let the cartographers fill in a lot of the details and just got some absolutely incredible results from that. There were really only two layers where I pretty much worked out the entire layout of them on my own and gave them to the illustrators and just said, do this. Um, there's a lot of the map makers in that book, and they really deserve a lot of credit for their contributions. I list them all at the end of the book with their URLs of their work.
Hmm.
But I'll give them a shout out anyway. Chloe Bolland, Dungeon Baker, Fernando Salvatierra, and Reclusive Cartographer. Terrific folks to work with, and just did some really beautiful, beautiful work.
Hmm. Another aspect of this book that made me think about things a little bit differently is the way you talk about traps.
Hmm.
Um, there are a lot of tropes associated with traps that come from the adventure genre or from like
Hmm.
pulp novels because they create very dramatic moments. This idea that you can turn around the corner and run into something that'll immediately kill you if you're not
Yeah.
careful is a
I
dramatic.
jokingly refer to those as Acme spring-loaded corridor blades.
Yes. Yeah, they create kind of dramatic story moments, but when you switch your brain to I have to set up defenses that are practical for me to kind of coexist with in a dungeon, a lot of that
Right.
stuff kind of falls apart. And I like the quotes that you put in about locks specifically, but this also applies to traps. Mostly they're there to delay people or deter them rather than
Hmm.
outright keep them out.
Yeah. And certainly rather than to maim or kill them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I talked about the orientation of designing a lair based on what assets a villain has to protect and how it's going to defend them in concert with carrying out its activities. I talked about loot, lore, and lives. The other two key basic concepts that I talk about are the different ways to assign value to an asset and I was going somewhere with this and it just fled. Um, wow, I'm gonna have to come back to this. I just completely lost my train of thought.
All good.
Yeah, I had a point, now it's gone.
It's all good. Happens.
I'll try to come back to it.
But yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
no, I remember now.
okay.
I remember now. And I'm actually flabbergasted that I forgot this because the cover illustration is an illustration of this very thing, which is that the three components of every defensive plan are detection, deterrence, and response. Those three, hold up the book cover again. Those three little goblins on the cover are detection, kid with the telescope up there, deterrence, pulling up the ladder, and response, the slingshot. It's all right there.
Yep.
But yeah, you have to have a way to know that a threat is imminent. You have to have measures that will stop or slow that threat from getting into the lair. And if somebody does breach the lair, you have to have a way of making them wish they hadn't. And so if any of those elements is weak or missing, you don't really have a defensive plan.
Right.
And that's another thing that I think is missing from a lot of traditional dungeons, especially the detection component. A lot of dungeons just don't really have guards. Any schmo can just walk right in and start causing trouble. No, you need to have some way to tell that somebody's coming who doesn't belong. And then you need to have a way to report that fact back. Because having scouts, having sentries, having guards does no good unless the fact that an intrusion is underway can be communicated back to everyone else who plays a role in stopping that intrusion.
Yep.
So communication is very, very important. One thing I always, even before I researched this book and started thinking this way, it was always a practice of mine when there was a dungeon that was pretty substantially populated. Like there are lots of creatures of one faction and they're scattered throughout the dungeon. When one group gets attacked and they think they're losing, they always run and tell the next group that this happened so that everyone else is on alert. Now, if the PCs get lucky, they catch up and they stop them from getting back and they've bought themselves a little more time to get further in. But when there's an intrusion, word should travel fast. And that's a principle that applies whether or not you're designing layers the way I recommend in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also feel like that aspect of there has to be rapid communication is another point against the Acme spring-loaded blades.
Right, yeah, what if one of your sentries is running back to report and he trips it and gets cut in half?
Yep.
Big oops. Yeah, you don't put deadly traps on transportation routes that your people routinely use in their everyday business. That's just a bad idea. You're gonna have a lot of whatever the equivalent of friendly fire is.
Yeah.
Now, where you do use traps like that is in places around the perimeter that are difficult for you to have guards overlooking. If you've got some kind of path toward your lair that's vulnerable and you don't have enough guards to watch for people coming that way, that's where you put a deadly trap.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Someplace where your people have no business being.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this quite a bit, in respect to combat, but also, reading some of this and how to defend your lair has got me thinking about this a little bit more. I like my RPGs to have the persistent threat of death, in that a misstep will result or can result in depending on the circumstance, in a player character dying, essentially due to their own either stupidity or inability to defend against something that they run up against because they made a mistake somewhere. But at the same time, death in RPGs represents a stopping point where, depending on how your tables run, either that's where the game ends for the night for a particular player, or now you have to go through the process of making a new character. So what I have been trying to think about and trying to put in my RPGs is things that are in a lot of ways worse than death, or more, I guess it's failure, but it's failure towards making life more difficult for player characters.
Failure with a chance of recovery.
Yes.
But also making that recovery difficult. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And I had devoted an entire chapter to prisoner interrogation.
Mm.
Ways of questioning prisoners and gaining valuable information from them. And I want to talk about Rise of Tiamat, because I recently finished the Tyranny of Dragons arc, Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, with my main group that I've been playing with since 2016.
Mm.
Actually, since 2015, but we had a false start and started over in 2016. And so that's when that group began Lost Mine of Phandelver, and then went on to Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat.
Mm.
So, Chapter 8 in Rise of Tiamat, the Red Wizards chapter, made me so angry that I just completely threw it out. I unexisted that chapter from the adventure for two reasons. One is that I am deeply, deeply opposed to any depiction of torture in a role-playing game. And this chapter just used it as an atmospheric element, which I thought was incredibly tasteless. But the other thing is, you've got this group of red wizards and their leader, who is supposed to be very, very smart, which is fine, makes perfect sense. They're all wizards. And she's interrogating the party. And it has some lines in there like, she's very good at sniffing out lies. She doesn't put up with being strung along, blah, blah, blah. Gives you all this stuff about her style. It never tells you what she knows or what she's trying to find out from the PCs.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot have an interrogation without knowing both of those things. You have to know how much the questioner knows already and what they don't know and are trying to find out. Without that, you do not have an effective interrogation. Those two things are crucial. Um, and so I just found that chapter completely unplayable as written, and I didn't consider it worth my effort to fix, and I chucked it. Um, but in my chapter on prisoner interrogation, I draw from an actual U.S. Army manual on military intelligence, and list a whole bunch of different approaches that you can use to to get subjects in the mood to answer questions.
Yep.
And none of them use physical coercion. None of them is about force. And in fact, good cop, bad cop trope that everyone loves actually doesn't work that well in practice and is really unworkable in a role-playing game because as the DM, you have to be both the good cop and the bad cop, and that's an acting challenge that, quite frankly, most of us are not up to. But there are a lot of other techniques that you can use, and you can play off how the players are choosing to role play their character's attitude, their degree of fear, their degree of resistance, whether or not they are really interested in keeping information away from their questioners or just don't really care, whether there are things that they want or care about very badly outside this situation in which they're prisoners and want to get back to. There are techniques for playing on all of these things, and I list a whole bunch of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can use these things to, rather than killing a group of PCs, you can capture them, take them prisoner, and have some fun role playing a questioning session. But you don't want to do that unless the villain actually has a reason to want to question them. Because, for example, there's some information that they have that the villain doesn't.
Right. Yeah, and that's, again, this is another interesting aspect of the way that kind of like movies have informed how we think about certain scenarios. In the real world, anyone who's ever worked as an interrogator or in any kind of field where there's information gathering will tell you that like physical torture is not a good way to get actual information because they'll just tell you what you want to hear rather than what's actually true.
Right.
Narratively speaking, and I think this is what Max and Victor in chat are getting at here. Narratively speaking, torture scenes generally exist to demonstrate the personality traits of the villain or the fortitude of the hero. And whether or not you want to use those, it's really up to whether or not a GM is comfortable using those things. It sounds like you very much don't care for that style of play, which it's not for everyone. That's fine. But I do like this idea that if you're going to do an interrogation, whether you use the tropes of torture or you use kind of more realistic interrogation tactics, there has to be some information that someone's actually looking for. Otherwise, they wouldn't even bother with the interrogation.
Yeah, although I'm going to stand my ground on my torture position. I really don't think it should be included at all. And my overarching rule on these things is and always has been treat sensitive topics with sensitivity. And there are some things that just should not be made light of.
Mm. Yeah, and honestly, like I could go either way on it. I've not ever done like a graphic torture sequence in my games. I've done interrogations, but again, I feel like that comes down to the way that everyone perceives it. So I'm not gonna like push back on you or anything like that. Just because it's again that's your preference for it, but I definitely will agree on the fact that you essentially have to have something of value to offer for an interrogation to happen, or there has to be something that someone needs to know to make that a reality. Otherwise, if they capture you and you don't know anything, they're probably just going to execute you.
Possibly.
Or ransom you, depending on the circumstances.
In which case you have a thrilling escape scene. Instead of trying to break in, you're breaking out.
But yeah, all of that does kind of work towards the idea that there are things out there kind of worse than death. So the idea that death is kind of the ultimate failure state in RPGs, I don't think that needs to necessarily be the case. I think it's the final failure state of you failed so much at this point you are going to be dead now. But in the interest of keeping the game going and keeping things interesting, I like the idea of finding different ways for failure to impact the party, including being captured and interrogated by the enemy. Now, we did have another unrelated question here from Crafty Matt. He very much wants to know... Let me see if I can find it here. Okay. He wants to know if you've expanded on Tucker's kobolds in How to Defend Your Lair.
You know, I actually didn't mention Tucker's kobolds. I think it's such a good example and such a well-known example that I didn't even really need to. Now, I do in the introduction talk about how kobold lairs are mentioned in Volo's Guide to Monsters, and how Volo's Guide to Monsters description of kobold lairs, which almost certainly was inspired at least in part by Tucker's kobolds, emphasizes the ways in which kobold lairs exploit the advantages that kobolds have. They are small, so they build their tunnels small. Larger creatures have to squeeze through them or get stuck. They like putting traps in passages that seem like they go somewhere worthwhile but don't. They are very good at working together, and so they have places where they can come at enemies from multiple directions at once. So everything, they're unlit because kobolds can see in the dark. They, in fact, have sunlight sensitivity. They have no particular reason to want light down there, which means not only will intruders have difficulty finding their way around, they'll give themselves away with their light sources. So everything about a kobold lair is advantageous to the kobold and disadvantageous to the intruder. And that, in general, is a good way to approach both lair building and combat across the board. Every creature wants to maximize its own advantages over its enemies.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There's this weird... And I think the reason for this is video games. I think video games have informed a lot of how modern gamers think about, how combat works. We've all played something like Final Fantasy, where you're in this kind of weird pocket dimension, just kind of exchanging attacks back and forth. But what it comes down to in role-playing games is these tactical elements are present, and you have, because everything exists in your imagination, you have more than just the limitations of computer code to work with. So it behooves GMs to focus on how would this monster in their lair create circumstances where the deck is stacked in their favor.
Right.
And doing so will create a more rewarding experience for your game. And there's not even an argument around that, in my opinion. If it's more challenging, then overcoming that challenge will create that high five, we did it moment at the table.
Exactly. That's what it's about, The tougher the struggle, the sweeter the victory.
Yep, absolutely. But no, I am kind of curious if you think that's something that has had an impact on the way that people view combat, especially I think the generation before mine uh, was very influenced by kind of CRPGs and the Final Fantasy series when it comes to the way that combat works in RPGs. Would you agree with that, or what are kind of your thoughts on that as far as
I don't really know because I'm from the generation before the generation before that.
gotcha?
So, my experience, my first experience with RPG combat was in Ultima 4.
Mhm.
So, we're going way back here. Um, I think that, well, I definitely think that movie tropes have a lot of influence, regardless of generation.
Yep.
Um, Television tropes, like, in movies and TV, how often does somebody take cover? Um, Actually, in movies and TVs, they probably do it more than they do in video games. I remember playing
Mhm.
Overwatch, and my God, trying to get people to take cover or look up. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. But I do think that I do think that most players definitely need some coaching or prompting um, to get them to that first point where they're realizing, um, oh man, the monster or the villain is not going to play nice. They are going to use elements of the surroundings against me. They're gonna, wait, what? He could hide behind that? Oh man, I didn't even think about that. You know, when the monster or the villain breaks out their first unfair trick, you know,
Mhm.
you get that sudden moment, where players' eyes get a little bit wider and they're like, oh, they realize that they have to step it up a little bit too in order to compete. Um, and I do like to see everyone competing on that slightly higher plane where, you know, you got everything around you, find a way to use it.
Yep.
You've got features, find a way to combine them, find a way to synergize. You've got teammates, you've got allies. Um, Work together. Your effect on each other is multiplicative. It's not just additive. You can do some great stuff if you think about how to do great stuff together.
Mhm.
And actually, when I was talking about Live to Tell the Tale and the ways I'd like to improve it, I would definitely like to add a chapter to that on um, how to work better as a group, how to look for ways to synergize as a party. Um, because I think party synergy not only dramatically increases the effectiveness of everyone in the party, it gives you this bonding experience. It's not just hey, I did this and you did that. It's we did a thing together, and it's worth high-fiving over. And the more different ways you can uh, you can find to enhance the abilities of your companions in the party,
Mhm.
um, the more you really are going to become an adventuring group and not just a handful of adventurers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely ways, especially in 5e, that classes can synergize with each other and make each
Hmm.
other kind of better. That I
Hmm.
think a lot of players forget because you end up with the wizard wants to cast their fireball, the warlock wants to do their eldritch blast, and so a lot of times it's not thinking about how can I synergize with my team members and create a tactical environment where we're going to come out on top. It's how can I set myself up where I can fireball and deal massive amounts of damage. So I think kind of realigning player expectations is a valuable thing to do. And I actually, on that subject, want to circle back all the way to the beginning of our conversation here. The letters that you got talking about TPKs that resulted from your book. I know there are some GMs out there who wear TPKs like a badge of honor. Like, I really stuck it to them this time. But at the same time, I also think a lot of those TPKs might have just been a result of the shock of we're doing things differently now. So do you think, even though that's not the goal, even though this isn't designed, this or any of your other books are not designed to be TPK manuals, do you see how like a TPK could be the first, essentially like their first brush with these tactics might result in something catastrophic like that just because they don't know how to think about it right?
Well, yeah, possibly. But to me, that's not fun. Um, I am my player's biggest fan. I always root for the PCs, and when I get a TPK, and it has happened a couple of times, to me, that's a failure on my part. It's a disappointment. I threw the frisbee out of their reach. I didn't throw the frisbee at that line between where they could reach it by working at it and where they couldn't, you know. I want to throw it just inside that line. I want them to work for it, but in the end to catch it. So if I accidentally killed them all, that means I didn't calibrate the experience right, because that's not what I was trying to accomplish. It means that, you know, maybe I should have only thrown two ghasts at them instead of three. Um, or maybe I should have just stuck with only one. Um, I really don't like to do that because it is a big downer for most players to have their PCs die. And when you're doing that to the whole group at once, um, you know, it would not be fun for me, and it wouldn't be fun for the players I did it to. Um, and You know, that actually happened in my Curse of Strahd campaign. Um, they they were in the Death House. I hope I'm not spoiling too much for anyone here. Um, and One of the players triggered an attack by a bunch of shadows, one per player, one per PC rather, and they got wiped. And part of it was them um, not realizing that they needed to just get out of there. Like they actually tried to stand and fight it, and they couldn't do it. But they had all just created. They were level 2. And you know, I almost think it's worse to kill a player at level 2 or level 3 than at level 1. Because at level 2, by level 2 and 3, they've had time to get attached to the character. Um, Level 1, big deal. Go back to the drawing board. But level 2 and 3, like they had hopes for these characters. They were going somewhere with them, and that's just ended. And so I ended up like retconning that into, you had this horrible vision of what would happen if you did this, and went on from there. Because they had 5 good, interesting characters, and I didn't want to make them throw those out and do it all over again. Um, so yeah, I don't see a TPK as a badge of honor. I see it as a DM screw up. And now that's not the same as one character dying. I'm not at all afraid to have one character die, because one character can potentially be brought back, or if the player feels like it, they can say, you know what, that's okay. I can let go of them. I can create somebody new. It's more in their hands. It's a lot more. That's a lot more workable than the entire party dying. Mm-hmm. And And this, by the same token, I don't really mind when it happens to me. My friend Julian, whom I mentioned in the introduction to The Monsters Know What They're Doing, was running a campaign, and I had what I thought was a pretty cool character. I had an Eladrin Battlemaster fighter, um, who was actually from the Feywild, and I was playing him as this kind of fish out of water character because the material world made no sense to him. Like just simple things like the fact that day and night go back and forth regularly just drove him nuts. To him it was just this incessant repetition like someone banging on a pot. um Drove him crazy. um so he got to level 3 where his season would change every time he took a long rest. And he was in the summer season. He was feeling his oats. He was always running to the front, ready to fight at a moment's notice. And he ran up on something that took the top half of his head off. That was a one-hit kill, instant death. And Julian was like, "Oh, God, man, I'm so sorry." And I'm like, you know what? Wisdom was his dump stat, and I knew the job was dangerous when I took it. And I, maybe someday I'll bring Laureanar back for something else in some other setting. Use that character again because I'm not done exploring him. But as far as that particular game was concerned, you know what? It's all right. It's all in the game, and my next character was a Kenku druid who became a druid because he figured by learning the ways of other creatures, he could regain the ability to fly. And that's pretty cool too.
I actually, I don't agree necessarily with the idea that a TPK is a failing on the GM's part. I think sometimes it can be, especially uh, if you overestimate what you're throwing at your players. But I think in some cases it can be because of a failing on the player's part. And honestly, I see retreat as always a viable option in combat. So the fact that that's always present, I think in that case,
Now you want to blame video games for something. I think you can blame video games for making people think that every encounter is always going to be calibrated so that they can succeed.
right.
And encouraging the idea that you can do this, it's within your reach. You don't need to run away. No one ever runs away in video games, except I don't know, maybe Dark Souls sometimes. But generally speaking, no one ever runs away in video games because there's no reason to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and also there are mechanics in 5e that make running away seem very undesirable, but sometimes you just got to do it anyway. Um, it is better to run than to die.
Yeah, and honestly, I think if you find yourself in that situation, because you can, as a GM, you can go back to the drawing board all you want and think about, well, how could I have done something differently here if you want to avoid a TPK. But at the end of the day, sometimes, one, the dice just don't go the way that you hope they'll go. Even if you are rooting for the players, if the dice aren't in their favor and the dice are in your favor, that's just, that's the way the dice rolled on that night. You can't do anything about that. And then the other thing is, with retreat being always on the table, even if you did accidentally, create something that's a little bit beyond what the players are technically capable of, they do have the option to run away, and there are other tactical options that might result in them kind of coming out on top if they do want to stand their ground. So at the end of the day, I don't think GMs should take the blame for a TPK on themselves or see it as a failing of their preparation. In the case that, you did something that's just straight up unfair to your players, after they retreat, you can go, sorry guys, that was my bad, if you feel
Yeah.
like you should. But
I guess I would say, um, I would see a TPK as a failing on my part if I had meant the encounter to be balanced and it turned out not to be. Um, Now, if I were deliberately throwing something at my players that I knew they couldn't handle, and that was supposed to be a demonstration of this is way above your pay grade, that you shouldn't even attempt this, um, and they don't take the hint and they attempt it anyway. I mean, yeah, in a situation like that, it's the logical consequence of their choices.
mhm.
Um, but generally, my attitude is I don't want to kill them all. I don't even want a bad roll to kill them all. Um, because I'm a fan of their stories and I want those stories to go on. And yeah, I wouldn't feel good about a TPK in that situation.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I think what it comes down to is a lot of what you're doing is you're running games in 5e. Um
Hmm.
I don't do a lot of 5e anymore. I've done a ton of 5e in the past. I know 5e very much emphasizes encounter balance. A lot of the games that I run nowadays, especially something like OSE or Dungeon Crawl Classics, uh, when it mentions encounter balance in the manual, it says, "Don't worry about this." There are, if you're in an orc encampment, there's 30 orcs, just because that's how
Yeah.
many orcs there are going to be. And so I do think it comes down to what game you're playing and what that game emphasizes, what that game's built around.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, no matter what system you're playing, I always see retreat as a viable option for the players. So I again, I think this just comes down to we're almost talking in two different game vernaculars in a lot of cases.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But I actually address this partly in How to Defend Your Lair, getting back to the book, um, because one of the tenets of this kind of defense is massing overwhelming combat power along the most probable path of approach. If somebody's coming at you, they are most likely going to come from a certain direction, and you want to pile just a ridiculous amount of defense on that direction. Now, you want to be able to move it as necessary if somebody comes from a different direction, but if it's overwhelmingly likely that somebody's going to attack from one direction, you want to put like 80% of your response force in that direction. And in 5e terms, that is always going to result in an encounter that is not only deadly by DMG guidelines, but like beyond deadly, super deadly. Half of your day's entire uh, XP budget deadly. I'm not saying don't do this. What I am saying is, um, number one, when your players are on their way in, to avoid just putting them into a wood chipper for no good reason.
Hmm.
Number one, make sure that the other encounters going in don't amount to more than either one medium encounter or two easy encounters. So, in other words, once you get inside a lair, you're basically going to have no opportunity to rest.
Yeah.
Not if the villain is doing its job. So, what that means is you cannot have a 6 encounter day. You can really only have like a 4 encounter day. Otherwise, people are going to run out of their resources. And and 3 of those encounters are one encounter.
Hmm.
So that means that everything else has to be just chip damage, nothing more. Um, They need to be able to go through those encounters relatively easily so that they are not completely wrecked by the one encounter that turns out to be ridiculously hard. And what's even better is if they play it smart enough, do a little reconnaissance, and figure out, oh heck, we can't go this way. This way is going to be way too much for us. Maybe it's not actually way too much, but it sure looks that way, and that's the point. It's not just response, it's also deterrence. And they look for another way in. And role-playing gamers are creative, and they'll find that other way in. They just need to work for it. Again, it's you're throwing the frisbee where they can catch it, but they got to work to catch it. And that's going to make the success more satisfying. I at Gamehole Con recently, I ran several Bust My Lair events, and one of them was the Lich's Crypt. And I'm not going to spoil the Lich's Crypt because I'm kind of proud of some of the ridiculously devious stuff that's in there. It's a lich after all. But there is one approach path. It is that encounter. It is that super deadly encounter. And it was epic. It was truly epic. At one point, the party wizard went down with 0 hit points, failed 2 death saves. Third death save, rolled a natural 20 and popped back up with 1 hit point, and ended up like casting a spell that won the encounter. So it was just a beautiful nail biter of a thing.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff at con games that really makes for a fun experience when you have that. Oh, we were all about to die, and then suddenly we were able to turn it around at the last minute. To respond to something you said earlier, and this will have to be one of the last things we discuss, just because we're running up on time here. In those circumstances where you have that layer that's full of kind of amassed military might, this is another thing where I think people should default to the examples that were given in fantasy novels or in movies and stuff, scouting your enemy's lair before going in and seeing kind of where troops are deployed and devising ways to draw, a massive force to one particular area to leave your path clear. I think stuff like that, it really behooves the players to put effort and energy into that over just seeing, all right, how many of these guys can we take head on in a fight? Because that
Absolutely.
You're playing smarter at that point. And when it comes to a small group of, in some cases, potentially even underpowered characters going up against the mass of a full garrison, you have to fight smarter, not harder.
Absolutely. And I hope that any players who read How to Defend Your Lair come away from it with a new appreciation of reconnaissance, because reconnaissance is hugely important, not just for the attacker, but also not just for the defender, but also for the attacker. And when I did the Gamehole Con Bust My Lairs, I provided a set of pre-gens who I just created at different levels. So like the exact same stable of characters at levels 7, 10, 13, and 20, depending on the lair that they were running. And so for the Lich, of course, that was a level 20 group. So there were 8 characters. The party could choose up to 5. And one of them was a character I created. I created this character to be the ultimate reconnaissance scout. His name is Muffled Bell. He's a Tabaxi Inquisitive Rogue. With, let's see, how did I design him? He's got the Observant feat, and I think I gave him the Mobile feat too. Yeah, Observant, Mobile, and Skulker. Just absolutely ridiculous passive perception and investigation, um, expertise in investigation, perception, and stealth. And because he's a tabaxi, um, if somebody spots him, he can use that first turn to double his movement and get out of there. Um, just a lot of fun as a character. Um, and yeah, I wanted to have him out there to encourage people to think about reconnaissance. Um, and actually, in my opinion, anyone out there who's thinking about doing this, I think the Inquisitive makes a better reconnaissance scout than the Scout. If you're thinking about creating a rogue to be your Scout, consider making them an Inquisitive. Scouts are very good for helping lead an ambush. But if you really want to see every possible danger, go Inquisitive.
Absolutely. Well, now that we are kind of at the end of our time here, I want to give everyone the chance to find out where they can get a hold of both this book, How to Defend Your Lair, and the other books that you've written. So, as always, I'm going to turn over these last few minutes to you to tell everyone where they can find your stuff and why they should pick up your books, which I think we've established here are pretty good resources.
Thank you. Saga Press is a trade publisher, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, so you can buy them at your local independent bookstore, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. They are available in ebook formats. All except Live to Tell the Tale are available in audiobook formats on Libro.fm or Audible. And if you want to order them from your friendly local game store, ACD Distribution carries them. And if your game store doesn't work with ACD, then they can order it wholesale from Simon & Schuster Distribution. Links to all of those booksellers are on my personal website, spyandowl.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, Keith, thank you once again for coming on the show. This was a great conversation. It's always great to talk with you about these things, even on the points where we disagree a little bit. But thank you again for coming on. This is a great book, and I'm glad that we had the chance to talk about this.
Thank you again for inviting me.
Awesome. All right, guys. That is it for tonight's episode of Rollin' Bones. Next week, I have been putting myself through a great amount of torture for next week's episode because in anticipation of the episode, I have watched every single D&D branded movie that has been released.
Oh.
And they're not good. They're not even entertainingly bad. They're just not good.
Has there been more than one before the current one?
Yeah, there was one in 2000. There was a direct-to-video sequel in 2004.
I didn't know there was a sequel.
There was another one that came out just in the UK called The Book of Vile Darkness that came out in like 2005 or 2006. And then there was I think direct-to-Amazon Prime animated adaptation of Dragonlance.
Wow.
And none of them are good. But Ben from the BS Bargain Bin podcast is going to be on. Anyone not familiar with BS Bargain Bin, they talk about awful movies, which is why they made me watch all of those awful D&D movies. And we'll be talking about all of them. We'll also be talking about kind of the upcoming D&D movie. I'm not optimistic, but I'm sure Ben will have his own thoughts and his own take to share with you guys. And we'll talk a little bit about what makes kind of a D&D type story work on the big screen. So, big talk all about movies, all about gaming next week and how they kind of mesh together. So until then, guys, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you guys next time.